The glass doors of the McDonald's on West 25th Street swung open with a quiet creak, letting in a gust of cool evening air. A young man stepped inside, his entrance unannounced and understated. He was tall, his presence marked by a certain quiet confidence that made him seem both inconspicuous and remarkable at once. Dressed in a gray hoodie that hung loosely over his broad shoulders and dark sneakers that barely made a sound against the tiled floor, he exuded an energy that was difficult to place. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his head slightly bowed, as if trying to shield himself from the curious glances that inevitably followed. The atmosphere in the McDonald's was vibrant, a mosaic of voices and movement. First responders filled many of the tables, their badges catching the light as they laughed and talked. The hum of the fryer, the clatter of trays, and the faint crackle of the drive-through speaker created a familiar background symphony. Yet, as the young man moved deeper into the room, a subtle shift began to ripple through the crowd. Barron Trump stood at the counter of the bustling McDonald's, his quiet presence a stark contrast to the lively energy of the room. The hum of voices and the rhythmic sounds of the kitchen formed the backdrop as the young man, dressed unassumingly in his gray hoodie, waited for his turn. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as though he were an observer in the midst of a world that hadn't quite noticed him yet. The cashier, a young woman with a ponytail and a practiced, welcoming smile, greeted him as he stepped forward. Her eyes flickered briefly with recognition, a fleeting sense of familiarity that she couldn't immediately place. Barron's voice was soft but clear as he placed a modest order. She nodded and began to punch the details into the register, but before she could finish, Barron leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Excuse me," he said, his tone measured and polite. "Can I take care of the meals for all the first responders here tonight?" The cashier froze, her hand hovering over the screen. She blinked, processing his words, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. "Are you serious?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chatter around them. Barron nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yes," he said simply, glancing briefly over his shoulder at the tables filled with firefighters, EMTs, and police officers. His gaze lingered on them for a moment before returning to the cashier. "They've had a long day. It's the least I can do." The young woman's eyes widened as she absorbed the request. She hesitated, as though trying to decide whether this was some kind of elaborate joke, but Barron's calm demeanor left no room for doubt. She leaned closer to him, lowering her voice further. "I'll need to talk to my manager," she said. He nodded again. "Of course," he replied, stepping slightly to the side to give her space. The cashier turned toward the back of the counter, catching the attention of her manager, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She motioned for him to come closer, her expression a mixture of disbelief and urgency. As she relayed Barron's request, her manager's brow furrowed in surprise. He glanced toward Barron, who stood quietly, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "Is he serious?" the manager asked under his breath, his skepticism evident. The cashier nodded. "He seems serious," she said, her voice tinged with awe. The manager considered this for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said, "let's make it happen." The quiet exchange sent a ripple of activity through the kitchen staff. The cashier turned back to Barron, her voice still low, but now tinged with respect. "We'll take care of it," she said. Barron gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you," he said. Behind the counter, the staff began moving with a sense of urgency. Orders were prepared with heightened focus, trays assembled with precision. Whispers spread among the employees as they processed the unusual request. "He's paying for all of them?" one of the cooks asked, his voice incredulous. Another nodded, glancing toward the dining area filled with uniformed men and women. "Looks like it," he said. The dining room, for the most part, remained unaware of what was happening. First responders continued their conversations, laughing and exchanging stories about the day's events. The buzz of their camaraderie filled the air, a stark contrast to the quiet, almost reverent energy now emanating from the staff behind the counter. One by one, the meals were prepared and brought to the front. The cashier, now joined by her manager, began calling out orders. As firefighters, EMTs, and police officers approached the counter to collect their food, they were met with an unexpected message. "It's already been taken care of," the cashier said, her smile warm but reserved, as though trying to maintain the mystery. The first responders' reactions varied. Some furrowed their brows in confusion, glancing around the room as if searching for an explanation. "By who?" a firefighter asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The cashier gestured subtly toward Barron, who now stood near the soda fountain, his back turned to the room. "Him," she said softly. The realization spread slowly at first, then more rapidly as whispers began to circulate. "Is that who I think it is?" one EMT asked, her voice low but tinged with astonishment. "Barron Trump?" Another nodded, the pieces clicking into place. "Yeah, that's him," he said. "But what's he doing here?" Barron remained in the background, deliberately avoiding attention. He sipped from his drink, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the tables of first responders but never lingering for long. His actions spoke louder than any words he could have offered. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. He was simply there, quietly observing the ripple effect of his gesture. The room's energy began to shift. Conversations about the day's emergencies and challenges gave way to murmurs of surprise and gratitude. "I can't believe it," one police officer said, staring at the bag of food in his hands. "He didn't have to do this." Another firefighter shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "That kid," he said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Gradually, the dining area grew quieter. The weight of the gesture settled over the room, leaving many of the first responders momentarily speechless. Some exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a shared sense of awe. Others simply sat in silence, their meals in front of them, as they processed the kindness they had just witnessed. Barron, for his part, remained a figure of quiet humility. He didn't flinch under the growing attention, nor did he seek to bask in it. Instead, he stayed near the window, his posture relaxed but purposeful, as though waiting for the moment to pass. The first responders, now fully aware of who had orchestrated the gesture, began to speak more openly about it. He could have just walked in, grabbed his food, and left, one EMT said, her tone reflective. But he didn't. He did this instead. Another nodded, his gaze fixed on Barron. "Says a lot about him," he said. The ripple effect of Barron's act of kindness extended beyond the first responders. The McDonald's staff, initially surprised, now moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The cashier, still processing the moment, recounted the interaction to her colleagues. "I thought he was joking at first," she admitted. "But he was serious. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Just kindness." As the last of the meals were handed out and the realization settled over the room, Barron made his way toward the exit. He moved with the same quiet confidence he had displayed upon entering, his hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't linger or look back, leaving behind an air of mystery and quiet admiration. The gesture, though simple, had left an indelible mark on everyone present. In a world often marked by division and expectation, Barron's act of generosity served as a poignant reminder of the power of compassion. It was a moment that would be retold, not because of his name or status, but because of the sincerity and humility that had defined his actions. The realization dawned slowly, one by one. The first responders approached the counter to collect their meals, only to be met with the same unexpected words. "It's already been taken care of." Confusion flickered across their faces as they exchanged puzzled glances, the hum of their earlier conversations now replaced by murmurs of curiosity. "By who?" a firefighter asked, his brow furrowed as he scanned the room. The cashier gestured subtly toward the young man standing near the soda fountain, his gray hoodie and dark sneakers blending him into the background. "That kid?" another firefighter whispered, incredulous. There was a mix of disbelief and admiration in his voice, the recognition of something extraordinary hidden beneath the ordinary. Gradually, the room fell quieter. Conversations about the day's emergencies faded into subdued whispers about the tall, unassuming figure who had quietly paid for their meals. An EMT, no older than 25, chuckled and shook her head in amazement. Are you serious? Him? As the realization spread, the mood shifted. Respect and wonder began to ripple through the room. No one approached Barron directly, as if instinctively understanding his desire to remain unnoticed. Yet, the weight of his gesture settled deeply, leaving the first responders moved and reflective. As the last of the meals were handed out, the atmosphere in the McDonald's had shifted entirely. Conversations, once loud and filled with laughter, softened into murmurs of awe and gratitude. But amid the growing realization of what had transpired, Barron remained in the background. He stood near the soda fountain, sipping his drink, his expression calm and unreadable. He made no effort to acknowledge the glances directed his way or the whispers that carried his name across the room. There were no gestures to draw attention, no moments to bask in the gratitude radiating toward him. Instead, he stayed quietly in the periphery, almost as if hoping to blend into the lively buzz of the restaurant. When the time came, Barron set down his empty cup and adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt. Without a word, he began moving toward the glass doors, his steps measured and deliberate. He paused briefly on the sidewalk outside, glancing back at the restaurant. Inside, the first responders were still exchanging quiet reflections on his act of kindness. His gaze lingered for only a moment before he turned and disappeared into the cool evening air, leaving behind an indelible impression that spoke louder than words ever could. As the door swung shut behind Barron, the hum of quiet disbelief lingered in the air. First responders, still clutching their meals, exchanged glances filled with a mix of gratitude and wonder. The initial shock of his gesture had given way to deeper reflections. "He didn't have to do that," one officer muttered, staring at the warm bag of food in his hands. "He could have just walked in and left, like anyone else." A firefighter seated nearby nodded thoughtfully. "And that's exactly why it means so much. We spend our days saving lives and protecting people, but it's rare to feel seen like this. This kid didn't just say thanks, she showed it." At another table, an EMT no older than 25 shook her head in disbelief. "It's not every day someone does something like that. Especially someone like him." The staff behind the counter buzzed with their own reflections, the cashier recounting the moment Barron leaned in with his quiet request. "I thought he was joking," she admitted to her manager, but there was no hesitation. He meant it. Gratitude filled the room as more first responders began to speak, sharing stories about their experiences and how rare such genuine gestures were. A firefighter leaned back in his chair, his tone reflective. "In this line of work, you see a lot of loss and hardship. It's easy to get jaded. But tonight, this was different. It reminds you that kindness still exists, even in the smallest of ways." The conversations turned to humanity and compassion, themes often overshadowed by the weight of their daily responsibilities. For a moment, the talk of fires extinguished, lives saved, and near misses faded into a quiet appreciation for a single act of generosity. "I think what gets me," one EMT said softly, "is that he didn't stick around for a thank you. He wasn't looking for recognition." Another nodded. "That's what makes it so real." Barron's simple act had left an imprint far greater than the meals he had paid for. It was a reminder that even in the busiest, most chaotic moments, one act of compassion could make the world feel a little smaller, a little kinder, and infinitely more connected. Outside the McDonald's, a passerby stopped on the sidewalk, catching a brief glimpse of Barron Trump as he disappeared into the evening. The young man's familiar face sparked recognition, and curiosity followed as the witness pieced together what had just happened inside. Moments later, they pulled out their phone and tapped out a post. "Just saw Barron Trump at McDonald's. Paid for meals for a room full of first responders, and walked out like it was nothing. Respect." The post went live, and within minutes, it began to gain traction. Comments poured in, sparking conversations that quickly moved beyond the simple act of paying for meals. People marveled at the humility in the gesture, the lack of cameras or entourage. "He didn't do it for attention," one user noted. "That's what makes it powerful." The conversation shifted toward privilege. Some pointed out that Barron's background afforded him the means to perform such acts, but many countered with reflections on how rare it was to see someone use their privilege in such a quiet, meaningful way. "It's not about the money," one comment read. "It's about the thought behind it." In a world obsessed with appearances, this was genuine. Soon, news of the gesture spread beyond social media. Local outlets picked up the story, tying it to broader themes of humanity and kindness. People shared their own stories of unexpected generosity and the lasting impact of seemingly small acts. The narrative wasn't just about Barron Trump. It became a conversation about what it means to care for others without seeking recognition. Back inside the McDonald's, the ripple effect of Barron's actions continued to unfold. The first responders, still seated, began sharing their thoughts on what had just happened. "It's easy to feel invisible in this line of work," one police officer said, his tone thoughtful. "People see the uniform, not the person. Tonight, though, we were seen, really seen." The cashier, still processing the moment, recounted the experience to a coworker. He didn't hesitate. No questions, no fanfare, just kindness. The sentiment resonated with the staff, sparking their own reflections. "It makes you think," her coworker replied, "about how much good you could do if you just acted without worrying about the payoff." Meanwhile, online discussions delved into the unexpected power of small gestures. "It's moments like these," one tweet read, "that remind us kindness doesn't have to be loud to make an impact." Others shared the story as inspiration, encouraging acts of generosity in their own communities. The story resonated widely because it wasn't staged or forced. It was a simple, sincere moment that highlighted the humanity we all share. As the night wore on, the narrative grew, each retelling reinforcing a central truth: kindness is contagious. Whether it's paying for someone's meal, holding the door open, or offering a genuine smile, small acts have the power to ripple outward, creating waves of connection and compassion. Barron's quiet act that night became more than a gesture. It became a reminder of the impact each person holds to make the world a little brighter.